Since the dawn of time, humanity has struggled with one question. Could we build a Star Destroyer? We still haven't really answered that question definitively, but assuming we could, today I wanted to try to figure out how many Earths it would take to build the entire Imperial fleet. Specifically, just the Star Destroyers of the Imperial fleet. Star Wars is not where you'd typically go if you want to deal with hard numbers. Some sources act like 6 guys and a starfighter are all you need to be considered a galactic threat, while in other sources you might see multiple Super Star Destroyers and thousands of other ships within one single fleet, often referred to as minimalist and maximalist sources respectively. Timothy Zahn, the author of the Thrawn trilogy, is honestly often fairly conservative in how many ships he says make up even large engagements, but in the novel Spectre of the Past, he established that the Empire, at its height, fielded around 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. And honestly, this is a number that I haven't really seen too many complaints about from either side of the minimalist or maximalist debate. So I think it's as good a number as we're going to get for us to work off of today. I do want to add the caveat that the Imperial fleet has many other ship classes as well. Some individual classes, like the IPV, likely number in the millions, let alone when you add in starfighters. But once you start going in that direction, we leave any sort of reliable or consistent number entirely behind. We just want to know how many Earths it would take to make the Star Destroyers. First, we need to figure out what it takes to build one Star Destroyer, and we're going to have to compare that to modern ships in some way. There's obviously a bunch of other big caveats here. First, the materials, engineering, and general science that would go into a giant spaceship firing lasers is far beyond anything we have available today. Usually with ships, you'd measure the size of it in tonnage, and you do that indirectly with the Archimedes principle via the water it displaces, since very few bathroom scales are up to the task of holding an aircraft carrier. So we're going to be going off of the assumption that as our galaxy gets to the level of technology needed for something like a Star Destroyer, the rough industrial output needed to make 1 ton of warship will remain relatively consistent proportional to the level of technology. So even though we're talking very different reactors and who knows what Durasteel would actually cost compared to steel, let alone weigh, we're kind of looking at this from a volume to volume perspective. So what would it take to make a navy of that size compared to the size of total navy we have now, and how many of those crew would like this video or subscribe for more? So to know that, we first need to figure out roughly what the total tonnage of navies are on Earth. I'm going to focus specifically on military tonnage, not including private boats or cargo ships, cruise ships, and so on. Including those would significantly increase our total capacity and reduce the number of Earths we'd need, but our coalition of Earths building this Star Destroyer fleet probably still needs all the regular shipping and extracurricular activities for Jeff Bezos, so those all have to be separate. Unfortunately, very few navies answered my call to ask how much tonnage they had, so I'm going to rely on globalfirepower.com. For the largest navies, I double-checked the numbers here against externally cited numbers, and the results were close enough within the error bars we're already going to have. And so even if the smaller numbers are off a bit more, it again won't change the outcome all that much. For the top 47 navies in the world listed on that site, the total tonnage adds up to 19,801,519 tons, which will round to 19.8 million. Belgium, number 47 on that list, is 0.05% of that total, so realistically our 19.8 million figure is not going to change much based on adding in any other missing navy. The Belgian navy was already only half of the size of the prior entry at about 10,000 tons, so realistically for that number to go from 19.8 to even 19.9, there would need to be at least 10 other navies around Belgium's size. From there, we need to find some kind of, hopefully semi-reasonable number for the Star Destroyer's individual tonnage. There have been attempts to give this number in-universe. One given value in Marvel Star Wars number 24 is 40 million tons. But this seems to have been pulled by the comic author from another fan work on Star Trek vs. Star Wars.net, who talked about what they did in a Reddit post, and I'll link to their site as well. I'm going to use a somewhat similar method to them, using 3D models to determine volume as a first step, but it changes slightly because of our stated premises about material density and whatnot. And more importantly, I do think it'd be fun to get my own number here and see how it compares. They determined their density though from other in-universe lore stuff, mostly from Star Trek comparisons. Whereas in this video, we're assuming density is similar to real-world warships with all the prior points about how we're assuming output would scale with technological changes, because we're really looking for a comparable volume. For example, if we wanted to try to send a modern naval ship to space with the tech we currently have, Adding stuff like heat shielding and whatnot probably increases the weight significantly per cubic meter than what we'd otherwise get. The 3D software Blender, which I use to make all of the animated campaign maps and any ships that I model for Thrawn's Revenge and the other mods I work on, has a 3D printing plugin which can get the internal volume of a model. And for our ISD today, we're going to be using the model made by Evil Bob the Bob for Empire at War Expanded. The number you'll get for this kind of volume will vary a bit by which model you use for something like this, but the most important thing here is going to be the proportions, and the proportions of this model are all correct. And since we are just looking for internal volume, this model being somewhat lower polygon with less internal mess to throw off the calculations is probably going to give us a cleaner number anyways. The result here is 102,558,629 cubic meters, which we will round to 102.5 million cubic meters, because I don't want to keep saying all those numbers. So now we need at least some kind of comparable volume figure of a ship where we know the tonnage, and then we can figure out the density per cubic meter. The point of comparison we're going to use here is the Gerald R Ford, the aircraft carrier, not the president. The number you would get would obviously vary slightly depending on which ship you used, but this is what our point of comparison will be. The tonnage of the Gerald Ford is pretty freely available, about 100,000 tons fully loaded. But what we need to make the comparison is the volume, which unfortunately doesn't seem to have any reasonable public figures. I keep seeing people throw around 1 million cubic meters from their own calculations, but they're definitely getting this volume just by taking the listed length, width, and height and multiplying them, which only works if the ship you're trying to get the volume of is a Borg cube. So I actually went to try the same method for getting the volume here as the ISD. For this, I grabbed the nice freely available model made by Wael on Sketchfab, which I'll link to in the description. I set that model to the correct scale in Blender, matching the length, width, and height of the listed figures on military websites and on Wikipedia. This initially returned a volume of about 300,000 cubic meters, but there's a problem here. The model has some nice interior bits, but the plugin will cut out any exposed bits from the calculation. So the more detail they did in the internal bits, the cooler the model is, but the harder it is to use for our purposes directly. So to deal with this, I did a quick shrink wrap modifier on a subdivided cube. This still doesn't give us a perfect number, but it makes sure we're dealing with a solid surface, and it should give us a much closer overall approximation at about 500,000 cubic meters. I actually did this with the ISD as well, creating a kind of shrink wrap modifier, but the number I got there was very close to the original, and it more just served to confirm the plugin's first reading was accurate and not confounded by too many internal bits tripping it up. So now we take our 100,000 tons of displacement and divide it by our roughly 500,000 cubic meters, which gives us a mass of 0.2 long tons per cubic meter. I did some further digging, and this value actually lined up pretty decently with some averages of other densities for other warships or space shuttles without heat shielding, so I'm pretty comfortable moving forward with this number. Now, since we know the cubic meter volume of the ISD, and we know the density of tons per cubic meter, we multiply those two together. So that's 102.5 times 0.2, giving us about 24.1 million tons. This ends up being significantly lower than the number given in Marvel Star Wars number 24 in 2016, but given we know that that number is sourced from an estimate based on much denser materials from Star Trek, this kind of makes sense. But the total military tonnage we came up with earlier put us at 19.8 million total tons currently on Earth. So if we look at total military output, we're not even at one Star Destroyer per Earth. With a fleet of 25,000 Star Destroyers, that makes the total tonnage we need to output 602.5 billion. Now we can divide that by Earth's current military capacity of 19.8 million tons, and that gives us 30,430 Earths being required to build the Imperial fleet of just Star Destroyers. And this is again based on a comparison to our current output of military vessels. On the other hand, it would take significantly fewer Earths to crew all of those vessels. This time we are just going to use straight up given in-universe numbers for crew. So there are about 37,000 crew required for one Star Destroyer. If you compare that to 344,600 active members of just the United States Navy, while it would take over 30,000 Earths to build the Star Destroyers, it would only take about 2,689 United Stateses to crew that Star Destroyer fleet. That's going to do it for today. Pretty sure I won't be publishing these results in any scientific journals because of all those caveats and assumptions we have to make, but I hope you've still enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if there are any other caveats or assumptions that you would add or remove or just change if you were trying to do this calculation. Remember to like and subscribe if you have enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.